This story was prepared through many hours of quiet research and focused effort. Each detail has been included with intention to offer a calm listening experience while treating the events with care. The purpose of this channel is to remember cases that might otherwise have faded into obscurity. She folded her hands in prayer every single morning, sang hymns in the pew every Sunday, and sat at the bedsides of the sick and dying. But what nobody realized, not for years, not until the bodies began multiplying like a quiet, spreading plague, was that the sickness was her, moving from house to house and heart to heart, carrying death in her apron pocket disguised as care. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover some disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the Velma Barfield story, aka the Death Row Granny, the Angel of Arsenic. Now let's begin. Somewhere in rural North Carolina, in the haze of the late 1970s, a soft-spoken, Bible-carrying grandmother was slipping arsenic, the kind scraped from rat poison pellets, into the food, tea, and beer of the people who trusted her most. Not strangers, not enemies, not victims pulled from shadows. These were her people, her mother, her boyfriends, the elderly couples who welcomed her into their homes, called her by her first name, and leaned on her for comfort during the most vulnerable hours of their lives. One by one, they fell into convulsions. Their bodies turned on themselves. Violent vomiting, intestinal agony, unstoppable waves of nausea. While she sat nearby, holding their hands, dabbing their foreheads with cool cloths, and telling anyone who asked that she couldn't explain why everyone around her kept dying. The doctors believed her. The neighbors believed her. Even her own children believed her for a time. Because when you imagine a killer, you do not picture a plump, gray-haired Sunday school devotee with a soft drawl and a concerned expression. You do not picture Velma Barfield. And that, more than anything, is what makes this story so deeply, disturbingly terrifying. The most dangerous predator she ever became was the one that looked exactly like someone's grandmother. This is the true story of a woman who weaponized trust itself. And by the time the world figured out what she truly was, at least 6 people were already in the ground. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. She baked them pies, prayed over their beds, and then put poison in their drinks. Velma Barfield killed 6 people before anyone dared to suspect a grandmother. To understand what Velma Barfield became, you first have to understand what the world made her. And to do that, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a red dirt tobacco farm in rural South Carolina, where the air smelled of poverty and pine, and where a little girl named Margie Velma Bullard came into the world on October 29, 1932. She was the second of 9 children born to Murphy and Lily Bullard, and from her earliest years, life offered her very little softness. The Bullard household ran on strict Pentecostal discipline and the grinding stress of financial scarcity. Murphy Bullard, her father, was a man whose temper moved faster than reason, whose hands found their way to his children with unsettling regularity. The family later moved to a small farm outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the landscape was flat and the social world was small. The kind of small where everybody knew your name, but nobody knew what happened behind closed doors. And behind the Bullard doors, something profoundly damaging was happening to Velma. She would later claim, from a prison cell decades later, that her father had sexually abused her throughout her adolescent years. These allegations were never formally proven during her lifetime, but those who studied her case closely, including a psychiatry professor from New York University who would eventually testify on her behalf, found her account consistent with the kind of fractured, compartmentalized inner life that emerges from severe, repeated trauma. Whether the abuse occurred exactly as she described it or not, what is beyond dispute is this. Velma Bullard grew up feeling trapped, invisible, and desperate for a way out of the home she feared. At 17 years old, she found it. She dropped out of school and married a local boy named Thomas Burke, a decision that, in the context of 1949 rural North Carolina, was not unusual for a girl of limited means and significant urgency. Thomas was decent, reportedly kind, and the early years of their marriage were, by most accounts, genuinely stable. They settled in Parkton, North Carolina, and built something resembling a normal life. 2 children were born. The couple worked. The bills got paid. And for nearly 15 years, Velma Barfield, still Velma Burke at this point, appeared to be just another quiet woman in a quiet southern town. Then 1965 arrived, and with it, the first fractures. Thomas Burke was involved in a serious car accident that left him injured and shaken. Around the same time, Velma underwent a hysterectomy, a medical procedure that affected her deeply, leaving her feeling diminished in ways she struggled to articulate. The physical recovery was hard. The emotional recovery may have never truly come. Doctors prescribed medications, and Velma took them, not just as prescribed, but beyond prescribed. She discovered that pills softened the edges of a life that had always felt too sharp. Prescription tranquilizers became a dependence before anyone thought to call it one. And a dependence, in the language of addiction, has a relentless forward momentum. In 1969, Thomas Burke died in a house fire. The fire started at night. Velma was in the house. The official cause of death was smoke inhalation. Investigators at the time saw no reason to look further. They concluded, a tragic accident. But in later years, as Velma's other crimes began to accumulate and investigators looked backward through her history with new and colder eyes, some would quietly wonder whether Thomas Burke had been her very first victim. Velma denied it. She would deny it until her death. But the timing, the financial pressures, the unhappy marriage, the insurance policies, planted seeds of doubt that never fully disappeared. Widowed, with 2 children and a growing pharmaceutical dependency, Velma moved her family back into her parents' home in Fayetteville. It did not take long before she began rebuilding her life with what appeared to be impressive resilience. She was, by all outward observation, a woman of faith and function. She attended church, she cooked, she cared for people, and she began seeing men again. One of those men was a widower named Jennings Barfield. Within a year of Thomas Burke's death, Velma and Jennings had married, and she had taken his surname, the name by which history would eventually remember her. Jennings Barfield was not in perfect health, and the marriage was described as turbulent almost from the start. The arguments were frequent, the stress was constant, and then, not long after one particularly heated confrontation, Jennings Barfield began to feel ill. He vomited, he cramped. His body revolted against itself in the way that arsenic poisoning makes a body revolt, from the inside out, like something had taken root in the stomach lining and was burning its way through. Jennings was rushed to a hospital, but the doctors attributed his symptoms to heart failure. On March 21, 1971, Jennings Barfield died. He was not yet old. He was not terminally ill. He simply died, surrounded by confusion and his grieving wife, who wept convincingly for the community that surrounded her. No one ordered an autopsy. Had they done so, they might have found what investigators would uncover years later when Jennings Barfield's body was finally exhumed. Traces of arsenic laced through his tissue like a signature. But in 1971, in rural North Carolina, the death of a man with a known heart condition barely raised an eyebrow. He was buried. His estate passed on. And Velma, widowed for the second time in 2 years, moved forward. Now back in her parents' home, she fell even deeper into her prescription pill dependency. The tranquilizers she consumed were no longer managing anxiety, they were driving behavior. To fund her habit, she began doing something she had done as a child in small, petty ways. She stole. She forged checks. She siphoned money from those around her. In 1975, it caught up with her when she was convicted of writing multiple bad checks and sentenced to 6 months in prison. She served 3. When she walked out of that cell, she seemed unchanged by the experience. Perhaps that was because she had already discovered something far more effective than bars at keeping consequences at bay. She had discovered that people rarely suspected the caregivers. She had discovered that illness, vague, mimicable, conveniently fatal illness, was something she could engineer, and she had discovered the quiet, devastating power of arsenic. But perhaps the most chilling chapter of this early period had already begun. Back in 1974, quietly, without fanfare, before Velma even went to prison. In the summer of that year, her mother, Lily Bullard, began suffering from severe stomach pain, violent nausea, diarrhea that left her wrung out and pale. She was hospitalized, but her symptoms eased before anyone could identify a cause, and she was sent home. The medical staff recorded no diagnosis. Then, in December of 1974, just months later, Lily Bullard fell ill again. This time with furious intensity. The symptoms were monstrous in their speed and savagery. Vomiting, convulsions, a body shutting down in stages. She was rushed to the hospital, but within 2 hours of arriving, she was dead. Her own mother, the woman who had carried her and raised her and opened her home when Velma had nowhere else to go. No autopsy was performed. The death was ruled inconclusive, and Velma Barfield stood over her mother's grave, dressed in black, and wept. The community wrapped their arms around her. They did not know that the grieving daughter at the center of that funeral was also the reason there was a funeral to attend. They could not have imagined it. And that was precisely the point. Because Velma Barfield had now discovered something that would define the remaining years of her freedom. The easier the lie, the longer it could run. And there was no lie easier to sustain than the appearance of a kind, suffering, God-fearing woman surrounded by terrible luck. She would carry that lie into the homes of 2 elderly couples, into the life of one more man who loved her. And she would carry it, steady as a heartbeat, until the day a laboratory result destroyed everything, and revealed to the world just how many people had already paid for her silence with their lives. By 1976, Velma Barfield had managed to construct, from the rubble of her fractured life, a new identity, one so persuasive in its presentation that it earned her access into the most intimate spaces of people's existence. She had become a caretaker. This was not a remarkable career choice in 1970s North Carolina. Home health aides were in demand, particularly among the elderly and infirm who wished to remain in their homes rather than enter the institutional machinery of nursing facilities. The work was unglamorous, physically demanding, and poorly paid, which made it exactly the kind of role that often went to women with limited formal education and few other options. Velma fit that profile neatly on paper. What made Velma different, what made her catastrophically, lethally different, was what she brought through the front door alongside her caregiving instincts. An insatiable need for money to feed her drug habit, a complete willingness to steal from those too weak or too trusting to notice, and a now practiced knowledge of how much arsenic it took to create a believable illness, and how much it took to kill. Her first caretaking assignment brought her to the home of Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, an elderly couple living in Lumberton, North Carolina. Montgomery was 94 years old. Dolly was 84. They were frail, dependent, and utterly at the mercy of the woman who now cooked their meals, managed their medications, and moved through their home with a familiarity that resembled devotion. Velma stole from them. She dipped into their finances, small amounts at first, then larger ones, the kind that required cover, the kind that needed a distraction. Montgomery Edwards fell ill in the early weeks of 1977. His body, already worn thin by age, buckled under symptoms that looked from the outside like the natural deterioration of a very old man. Nausea, vomiting, stomach pain that left him doubled over and moaning. The doctors saw an elderly patient whose body was failing. They did not see poison. Montgomery Edwards died on January 29, 1977. Dolly Edwards outlived her husband by exactly 1 month and 2 days. And in those weeks, she experienced something that people who suffer arsenic poisoning often describe in the moments when they are still coherent enough to speak. A burning sensation that moves from the stomach outward, a cramping that feels like internal rupture, a thirst that no amount of water can satisfy because the water itself may have been poisoned. Dolly deteriorated rapidly. She experienced the same aggressive gastrointestinal symptoms as her husband. And on March 1, 1977, Dolly Edwards died, her body completely destroyed by the arsenic that Velma had been administering with cold, methodical patience. 2 people, 1 household, dead within 5 weeks of each other. And Velma Barfield walked out of that home without a single question asked. She was reassigned almost immediately to another elderly client, John Henry Lee, a 76-year-old man whose wife, Record Lee, had broken her leg and required assistance around the house. Once again, Velma moved into a position of profound trust. Once again, she began stealing. Once again, she found herself in the position where she needed to buy time, to create confusion, to obscure the financial trail she was leaving behind. John Henry Lee began to feel ill in the spring of 1977. His symptoms were nearly identical to those that had felled the Edwards couple. Severe gastrointestinal distress, vomiting so violent it left him exhausted, pain that radiated through his abdomen with a ferocity that seemed almost mechanical in its consistency. The doctors who examined him diagnosed a severe stomach virus. It was, they reasoned, the kind of ailment that struck older bodies hard. There was no particular reason to investigate further. John Henry Lee died in June 1977. He was buried. His death was recorded as natural causes. A stomach illness that his aging body had simply been unable to survive. Record Lee survived, presumably because she was mobile enough, or perhaps because the financial pressure on Velma had briefly eased. But the Lee household had run its course as far as Velma was concerned. There was nothing more to take, no more debt to conceal, and the caregiving assignment concluded without ceremony. What had just occurred in Robeson County, North Carolina, across the span of approximately 6 months, was an almost invisible massacre. 3 people, Montgomery Edwards, Dolly Edwards, and John Henry Lee, had been methodically poisoned by the woman paid to keep them alive. Their deaths had produced no criminal investigations, no autopsies, no raised voices in any sheriff's office. The doctors had seen old people dying, which was, in their experience, what old people often did. The community had seen a hard-working caretaker losing her patients to natural causes. And Velma Barfield had walked away from each death more confident than before. Because confidence is what goes undetected, death teaches a killer. Every body that went into the ground without suspicion was, in Velma's experience, proof that her method was working. Proof that her disguise was holding. She was not careless. She was not reckless. She was, in the most clinical sense of the word, practiced. By late 1977, Velma had moved in with her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor, a relative of Dolly Edwards, the woman she had already killed. This is one of the most chilling details of the entire case. The man she now shared a home with was connected by blood to one of her own victims. Whether she felt any shadow of guilt about this particular proximity, or whether it simply registered as an unfortunate coincidence, is something only she could have answered. What is known is that she functioned normally in the relationship. She cooked, she cleaned, she attended church events and revival meetings at Stuart's side. She presented herself as a devoted, affectionate partner, and she was stealing from him. The check forgery began almost immediately. Velma had a talent for accessing other people's finances, for identifying the moment when someone's trust was large enough to exploit. She forged Stuart's checks, siphoning money to sustain the pill consumption that had become the central organizing force of her life. The pills were not a side story in this case. They were the engine of it. Everything she did, every person she poisoned, every lie she constructed, was in service of maintaining a chemical dependency that had long since become larger than her conscience. Stuart Taylor began to notice discrepancies. The numbers didn't add up. There were transactions he couldn't account for. And one evening, in the way that men sometimes discover betrayal, quietly while reviewing ordinary paperwork, Stuart Taylor realized that the woman living in his home had been stealing from him. What he did not realize was that this discovery had just made him a target. According to what Velma later confessed, she had not intended to kill Stuart Taylor, not at first. She had only wanted to make him sick enough to create a delay, a window of time in which she could replace the money she had taken before he recovered and pressed the issue. She mixed an arsenic-based rat poison, the same product she had used before, scraped and dissolved until it became invisible in liquid, into his beer and his tea. Stuart Taylor drank it. Within days, he was vomiting with catastrophic intensity. His abdomen cramped and contracted in waves. He was hospitalized, and Velma was at his bedside, the concerned companion, dabbing his forehead and holding his hand and assuring the nursing staff that she couldn't understand what had happened to him. He had seemed fine. She was devastated. Stuart Taylor died on February 3, 1978. At his funeral, Velma wept. People offered her condolences. The loss of a partner, they told her, was one of life's deepest cruelties. She nodded. She accepted the sympathy. She thanked them for their kindness. And then, in an almost incomprehensible twist, something happened that not even Velma could have anticipated. Somewhere in the community, someone was talking. Someone who knew something or suspected something, or had been carrying a weight of private terror that had finally grown too heavy to hold. A woman called the police. She identified herself as Velma's sister, though this detail would later become murky in the retelling. She told the officers that Stuart Taylor had not died of illness. She told them that Velma had poisoned him. She told them that Velma had done it before, to their own mother. The officers might have dismissed the call. Anonymous accusations after a funeral were not unprecedented. Grief made people strange. Family dynamics made people stranger. But then Stuart Taylor's autopsy results arrived. And in the tissue of a man whose death had been charted as mysterious illness, the laboratory found something that could not be explained away, could not be rationalized, could not be attributed to bad luck or old age or a failing digestive system. Arsenic. Enough of it to confirm that Stuart Taylor had not died of illness at all. He had been murdered. The investigation that followed would tear open not just Velma's present, but her entire past, and what investigators found, as they dug deeper, would leave even experienced detectives standing in silence, trying to reconcile what they were reading with the image of the soft-spoken woman they had arrested. The moment the arsenic report landed on the detective's desk, the investigation shifted from a single suspicious death into something far larger, far darker, and far more historically significant than anyone in Robeson County had ever handled before. Velma Barfield was brought in for questioning. She was, by all accounts, composed. She did not storm or shout or make theatrical declarations of innocence. She sat in the interrogation room with the careful stillness of someone who had spent years practicing calm in the presence of crisis. Because she had. Every deathbed she had attended, every funeral she had navigated, every doctor she had spoken to while the people she poisoned lay dying around her. All of it had been training in the art of maintaining a composed, credible surface while catastrophe moved beneath it. Initially, she claimed to know nothing. She was grief-stricken, she said. She was overwhelmed. Stuart's death had been a devastation, and she could not account for the arsenic because she had nothing to do with it. The investigators listened. They nodded, and then they began pulling threads. They looked at the pattern of deaths surrounding Velma Barfield. Not just Stuart Taylor, but the Edwards couple, John Henry Lee, her own mother. They cross-referenced dates. They noted the similar symptoms reported in each case. The sudden onset of violent gastrointestinal distress, the rapid deterioration, the deaths attributed to stomach illness or natural causes. They recognized the signature of arsenic poisoning, a substance that, when administered in small, repeated doses, mimicked a number of common illnesses well enough to fool a physician who had no reason to suspect foul play. They applied for exhumation orders. The decision to dig up the dead is not made lightly. It is expensive, procedurally complex, and emotionally charged in ways that extend far beyond the immediate case. Families have to be notified. Legal frameworks have to be navigated. And in communities like Lumberton and Fayetteville, where gossip traveled faster than official press releases, news of exhumations would ripple through the social fabric with the force of a stone dropped into still water. But the investigators pressed forward. And what those exhumations found would validate every dark suspicion that had begun accumulating since the arsenic report. The body of Jennings Barfield, Velma's second husband, dead since 1971, buried for 7 years, was exhumed and examined. The laboratory analysis came back with a result that was, by this point, almost expected but no less devastating in its confirmation. Arsenic had been present in Jennings Barfield's body at the time of his death. He had not died of heart failure. He had been poisoned. Montgomery Edwards, Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee, Jennings Barfield. Lily Bullard. The names stacked against Velma's history like an indictment written in graves. Each one a person who had trusted her. Each one a person she had moved through the world to kill, not in explosions of passion or rage, but in the slow, patient, grinding methodology of someone who had decided that the inconvenience of a person's existence outweighed the horror of ending it. When confronted with the evidence that was mounting around her like floodwater, Velma Barfield did something unexpected. She confessed. Not to everything, not at first, and not ever in full. She would, until the end of her life, deny involvement in the deaths of her two husbands, Thomas Burke and Jennings Barfield. But she admitted to poisoning Montgomery Edwards, Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee, and her own mother, Lily Bullard. She framed each confession around a consistent, central explanation. She had never meant to kill them. She had only wanted to make them sick. She had stolen money from each of them to pay for her medication, and she had poisoned them to buy time, to create a window in which their temporary illness would distract from her financial crimes long enough for her to repay what she had taken. "I just wanted to make them sick," she told investigators. "I didn't mean to kill them." This explanation, offered with apparent sincerity, created a profound dissonance in those who heard it. Because the mechanism of arsenic poisoning does not produce nausea and a few days in bed. Arsenic, administered in the doses that Velma Barfield used, produces a methodical, escalating destruction of the human body. It attacks the gastrointestinal system first, the stomach, the intestines, the gut lining, producing vomiting and diarrhea so severe that victims become dehydrated and disoriented within hours. As the poisoning progresses, it moves into the nervous system, producing a tingling, burning sensation in the extremities that some survivors have described as the feeling of their own body being set alight from within. The hair begins to fall out. The skin changes. The kidneys and liver, overwhelmed by the systemic toxicity, begin to shut down. To claim she only wanted to make them sick while using the quantity she used was, at minimum, an extraordinary exercise in self-deception. At maximum, it was one more lie layered over a foundation built entirely of them. The prosecution of Velma Barfield was assigned to a North Carolina district attorney named Joe Freeman Britt, a man who had, at that point, sent more people to death row than any other prosecutor in the United States. He was experienced, methodical, and possessed of a particular conviction about the meaning of justice that made him deeply formidable in a courtroom. The state chose to try Velma specifically for the murder of Stuart Taylor, not because the other deaths were less real or less prosecutable, but because the evidence in Taylor's case was the freshest, the most thoroughly documented, and the most damning. The arsenic in Stuart Taylor's system had been identified before his body had time to deteriorate. The case was clean. The prosecution had everything it needed. The defense attempted several strategies, the most dramatic of which involved the testimony of Dr. Dorothy Otno-Lewis, a psychiatrist from New York University whose research on violent behavior was among the most respected in her field. Dr. Lewis testified that Velma Barfield suffered from dissociative identity disorder, what was then still commonly called multiple personality disorder, and that one of her alternate personalities, an entity that identified himself as Billy, had been responsible for the killings. Dr. Lewis testified that she had personally spoken to Billy during her evaluations of Velma, and that Billy claimed to have committed the murders in response to the sexual abuse that Velma had suffered in childhood. It was a remarkable argument, psychologically sophisticated, clinically grounded, and delivered by a credentialed expert with genuine conviction. But the jury found it insufficient. When they deliberated over the death of Stuart Taylor, they returned a verdict of guilty on first-degree murder. They found aggravating circumstances. They recommended death. Velma Barfield was sentenced to die in the gas chamber, later commuted to lethal injection as North Carolina updated its execution methods. She was sent to Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she would spend the next 6 years of her life on death row, in an area of the facility designed for prisoners considered escape risks or mentally unstable, because at the time North Carolina had no dedicated death row for women. She was the only woman awaiting execution in the state. And during those 6 years, Velma Barfield underwent a transformation, or at least the performance of one, that would generate more controversy than almost any aspect of her case. She became, by every outward measure, a deeply religious woman. She had always been connected to faith, the Pentecostal upbringing, the church attendance, the revival meetings, but on death row, her relationship with Christianity became the central axis of her life. She mentored other prisoners. She corresponded with religious figures. She participated in prison ministries and led Bible studies and became, in the language of those who knew her during that period, a genuine source of comfort to people who had very little comfort available to them. The question of whether this transformation was authentic spiritual growth or the desperate performance of a woman trying to avoid execution is one that her case generated in abundance, and one that may never be fully answerable. What is certain is that her faith became the basis of a significant clemency campaign that reached all the way to the governor's office. The campaign failed. By the early 1980s, the name Velma Barfield had traveled far beyond the borders of rural North Carolina. Her case had become, in the fractious and politically charged atmosphere of a nation still wrestling with the reintroduction of capital punishment, a symbol around which enormous competing forces gathered. She was a woman. She was a grandmother. She was born again. She was a serial poisoner who had killed, depending on whose count you accepted, somewhere between 4 and 7 people, including her own mother, her own husband, and the elderly individuals who had invited her into their homes and called her their caretaker. The people who wanted her to die and the people who wanted her to live argued with equal ferocity, and neither group was entirely wrong. From death row, Velma continued her religious work with a consistency that even skeptics found difficult to dismiss as pure theater. She formed deep, lasting relationships with fellow prisoners, prison chaplains, and advocates who visited her regularly. She gave interviews in which she spoke about her drug dependency, her childhood trauma, and her crimes with a mixture of candor and sorrow that struck many who heard it as genuine. She maintained, until the end, that she had never intended to kill anyone, that the arsenic was meant to buy time, not to end lives, and while the courts and the evidence rendered that claim legally irrelevant, it remained personally significant to her. In 1984, a coalition of advocates, including religious organizations, prison reform activists, and mental health professionals, launched a formal clemency campaign directed at Governor Jim Hunt of North Carolina. Hunt was, at that particular moment, engaged in one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country, challenging the incumbent Jesse Helms for his seat. The timing of the clemency appeal placed Hunt in an extraordinarily difficult position. To grant clemency to a convicted serial killer, in the middle of a competitive election in a state with strong capital punishment sentiment, carried enormous political risk. To deny it carried the weight of sending a grandmother, a converted, apparently rehabilitated grandmother, to her death. Governor Hunt denied clemency. His decision ignited fierce debate. Protesters gathered outside Central Prison. Ministers prayed. Death penalty opponents argued that Velma Barfield's execution demonstrated not justice but vengeance. Supporters of the execution argued that the number of people she had killed, and the manner in which she had killed them, the cruelty of using poison on the elderly and infirm who trusted her, demanded the ultimate legal consequence. Inside the prison, as November 2, 1984, approached, Velma Barfield prepared for death with what witnesses described as extraordinary composure. She declined to request a formal last meal in the traditional sense. What she asked for was simple, almost achingly ordinary: a bag of cheese doodles and a can of Coca-Cola. She received them. She ate them. She asked to be dressed in pink, a color she had always loved. The prison granted this request. She wore pink pajamas to her execution. She spent her final hours with her son Ronnie Burke, who had, in an act of almost unbearable moral complexity, been the person who turned her in. Ronnie had loved his mother. He had also been the one to call investigators after she confided in him that she had poisoned Stuart Taylor. He had turned her in because he believed it was right. And he spent the years that followed living in the particular anguish of a man who had done the right thing and could not fully make peace with what it had cost him. On her final night, he sat with her. They prayed together. They said goodbye. At approximately 2:15 in the morning of November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was escorted from her cell and brought to the execution chamber at Central Prison. A lethal injection. A method that was, on this occasion, being used on a woman for the first time in American history, was administered intravenously. Witnesses reported that she did not resist. She did not weep dramatically or make final declarations of outrage. She lay on the table, and she appeared, as the chemicals entered her bloodstream, to simply relax. The tension in her body eased. Her breathing slowed. Margie Velma Barfield, born October 29, 1932, in rural South Carolina, died at 2:15 a.m. She was 52 years old. Outside the prison walls, the world she was leaving behind was anything but quiet. A group of her supporters stood vigil in the cold November air, candles flickering, voices raised in the soft, mournful sound of hymns. The same hymns she had sung in church at revivals, at the bedsides of the people she had poisoned. Somewhere in the same darkness, others gathered not to mourn but to mark an ending. People who believed the death of Velma Barfield was, whatever its complications, a form of justice for the 6 or 7 people whose last conscious experiences had been the burning, convulsing agony of arsenic working its way through their bodies. Both groups were standing in the same November dark, separated by their beliefs, united by the fact that what had just occurred was genuinely, historically unprecedented. For the first time since 1962, an American woman had been executed. For the first time ever, a woman had been executed by lethal injection. And the woman at the center of it all was a grandmother who had killed people with rat poison while nursing them back to health. The legacy of Velma Barfield is not simple, and it does not fit neatly into any single narrative. She was clinically and legally a serial killer. The evidence of her crimes was overwhelming. The arsenic was in the bodies, her own confessions were on record, and the pattern of deaths that followed her from household to household was too consistent and too specific to be attributed to coincidence or misfortune. She poisoned the sick and the elderly who relied on her, and she poisoned the people who loved her, and she did it repeatedly, methodically, and without drawing the attention of a single medical professional for years. She was also a woman whose life had been shaped, from its very beginning, by forces of genuine damage: abuse, poverty, addiction, and the particular cruelty of a healthcare system that gave tranquilizers to troubled women and then abandoned them to their dependencies. The drug addiction that drove her financial crimes, and the financial crimes that she used arsenic to conceal, were not inventions or excuses. They were real. And the question of how much responsibility a person bears for actions taken within the grip of a decades-long pharmaceutical addiction is not a simple one, even when those actions include murder. None of this changes what she did. None of it restores the lives of Montgomery Edwards, Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee, Lily Bullard, Stuart Taylor, or Jennings Barfield. None of it erases the particular horror of what arsenic poisoning does to a human body. The way it dismantles a person from the inside, organ by organ, in a process that is neither quick nor dignified. The people she killed suffered enormously before they died. They suffered in front of her, and she stayed. She held their hands. She told them she couldn't understand what was happening, and then they died and she moved on to the next one. That is the thing about Velma Barfield that lingers longest after the facts have been absorbed and the timeline has been studied and the arguments about culpability and justice have been made and countered and made again. The intimacy of it, the closeness, the way she operated not at a distance, not through anonymity, not in the dark corners where most violence hides, but right there, in the light, in the sick rooms and the kitchens and the church pews, right beside the people she was killing, wearing the face of a woman who cared. That is what the arsenic could not fully explain, and what no psychological diagnosis could entirely account for. The capacity to look at a human being who trusted you and loved you and needed you, and to choose, deliberately, the poison. When the toxicologists examined Stuart Taylor's body and found the arsenic, they had a name for what had killed him. When the historians examined Velma Barfield's life and found the pattern, they had a name for what she was. But the question that sits beneath every name, every diagnosis, every legal verdict, is one that this case, like so many great terrible cases, refuses to answer cleanly. How does a person become capable of this? How does a woman who genuinely loved her Bible, who wept at revival meetings, who comforted dying strangers with apparent sincerity, How does that same woman scrape powder from a rat poison packet and dissolve it into a glass of sweet tea and carry it, steady-handed, to the man who trusted her completely? We do not have a perfect answer. What we have are the graves. 6 of them, spread across rural North Carolina, belonging to people whose last days were consumed by pain they didn't understand and whose deaths, for years, went without justice. They have it now, and somewhere in the machinery of history, in the archive of American crime, in the particular category of evil that operates not through brute force but through absolute proximity. Velma Barfield, the death row granny, the angel of arsenic, remains one of the most deeply unsettling figures ever to have walked quietly through an unlocked door and sat down beside someone who had no reason to be afraid. They should have been afraid. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Freeway and the Dark. The case of William George Bonin, the freeway killer. There is a particular kind of ordinary that deserves a second look. Not the obvious kind of ordinary. Not the strange neighbor with the overgrown lawn or the man who never waves back. That kind we've been trained to notice. We've been told to watch for it. What I mean is the kind of ordinary that is almost perfect. The kind that has been practiced. The kind that looks the same at 9 in the morning as it does at 2 in the afternoon, whether someone is watching or not. The kind that coworkers describe later, in front of cameras and under fluorescent lights, with words like, "He was just a normal guy. He seemed totally fine. I never would have guessed." William Bonin drove a 1972 Ford van through the sun-bleached corridors of Southern California for a little over a year. He had a job. He had a neighbor he liked. He went to parties. He talked about the news. He kept a scrapbook. And when the bodies of young men and boys began appearing along the freeways of Los Angeles and Orange County, beside the on-ramps, behind the dumpsters, near the drainage gullies that run alongside the highways most people drive every single day without ever looking down, Bonin was among those who followed the story closely. He followed it so closely, in fact, that he once told a coworker, with what appeared to be genuine concern, that whoever this killer was, he was giving people like him a bad name. He kept the newspaper clippings in a box in his glove compartment. Between the summer of 1979 and the spring of 1980, somewhere between 14 and 21 young men and boys lost their lives on the roads and freeways of Southern California. The youngest was 12 years old. He had been waiting for a bus that would take him to Disneyland. The oldest was 19. Most were hitchhiking, trusting the basic social contract that says a stranger offering a ride is probably just a stranger offering a ride. They were wrong, and the system that was supposed to prevent that wrongness had failed them. Not once, but repeatedly, methodically, across years and institutions and hearings and parole boards that looked at William Bonin and saw, each time, a man who was getting better. This is the story of how a man becomes the thing he becomes. It is not a story about monsters, because monsters do not exist. What exists is something harder to look at. The long, slow architecture of damage, the institutional failures dressed in paperwork, and the ordinary face of something that was never ordinary at all. This is the case of William George Bonin, known to Southern California as the Freeway Killer. Willimantic, Connecticut, in January of 1947, was a small mill town in the eastern part of the state. The kind of place where people knew each other's last names, where winters arrived hard and early and children played unsupervised in ways that were common then and feel almost unimaginable now. William George Bonin was born there on the 8th of that month, the second of 3 sons. There are people who study the beginning of a life the way an archaeologist studies a dig site, carefully, aware that what they uncover will be uncomfortable, aware too that the discomfort is part of the point. When researchers and psychiatrists later tried to understand what William Bonin had become, they returned again and again to those earliest years. And what they found, sitting just beneath the surface of a perfectly unremarkable American childhood, was layer upon layer of harm. His father, Robert Bonin Sr., was a compulsive gambler and an alcoholic. These were not incidental details. In January of 1950, when William was barely 3 years old, Robert Bonin gambled away the family home in a card game. Not a figure of speech. The actual house gone. The family was forced to move in with Alice's father, with William's maternal grandfather, in Willimantic. His name was never spoken easily in court documents. He was a convicted pedophile who had already sexually abused his own daughter, Alice, who was also William's mother. The children went to live in that house. Alice Bonin struggled with alcoholism of her own. She was known to disappear for stretches of time. The neighbors later recalled seeing the Bonin boys on the front steps looking hungry and unwashed, waiting for someone to come back. Sometimes they did not come back for days. When Alice was absent and Robert was away gambling, there was the grandfather. William was placed in a Catholic orphanage at the age of 6. He stayed there until he was 9. Later, when forensic psychiatrists interviewed him as an adult, he would disclose that the abuse had not stopped there. It had followed him into the orphanage, perpetuated by older boys, in the way that cycles of harm tend to reproduce themselves in closed and unsupervised environments. He was returned home at 9. He was arrested at 10 for stealing license plates. By the time he was sent to a juvenile detention center for those and other petty crimes, the pattern had already taken shape. A child who had been taught by the people who were supposed to protect him that power moves in one direction, that the body is a site of someone else's will, and that authority protects itself, not you. In detention, he was abused again. There is a question that every serious researcher eventually has to sit with in cases like this one. At what point does explanation become excuse? The answer, as far as anyone can determine, is that it does not. Understanding why something happened is not the same as saying it had to happen. Millions of people survive childhoods of this severity, survive abuse, neglect, institutional failure without ever harming another human being. The presence of a traumatic past is a context, not a permission slip. But the context matters, because the context is also a story about what we, as a society, failed to do in time. In the late 1950s, the Bonin family relocated to Coventry, Connecticut. William was 12. He showed aptitude in mathematics and science at school, though his grades were otherwise unremarkable. He was described as an outcast, uncomfortable around peers without close friends. He had, by this point, already begun to molest younger children in the neighborhood, something his mother was aware of and deeply troubled by. It was a source of constant friction between them. In late 1960, the family faced foreclosure again. His father had been offered employment as a machinist in Downey, California, a suburb in the southeast of Los Angeles County, a quiet grid of tract homes and wide streets, built on the promise of the post-war American dream. In early 1962, the family purchased a home in nearby Torrance. William was 15. He attended North High School in Torrance, where he remained an outsider. He did not date. He had no close friends. His pedophilic urges, which he later confessed had been present for years, were carefully concealed. He graduated in 1965. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, and it is one that those who later defended Bonin at trial would attempt to lean on heavily, with limited success. After high school, William Bonin became engaged and enlisted in the United States Air Force. He served in the Vietnam War as an aerial gunner. He logged over 700 hours of combat and patrol time. At one point during his service under enemy fire, he risked his own life to pull a wounded fellow airman to safety. He received a Good Conduct Medal for that act. He was, by the accounts of those who served alongside him, a reliable and capable soldier. He also sexually assaulted 2 soldiers under his command at gunpoint around the time of the Tet Offensive in 1968. The military did not learn of this until after his honorable discharge in October of that year. The contradiction is worth sitting with. William Bonin was, in a certain narrow register, a brave man. He risked his life for someone he cared about. And he was also, in another register, precisely what he had always been. Someone who used power to take what he wanted from people smaller than himself. He returned from Vietnam in late 1968 and discovered that the woman he had been engaged to had married someone else. He was 21 years old. He moved back to Connecticut briefly. And in November of 1968, within weeks of his return, he committed his first known sexual assault. By the time he was indicted in 1969, on 5 counts of kidnapping and 4 counts of sexual assault against 5 youths between the ages of 12 and 18, the pattern that would define his life had been clearly, if cruelly, established. He was evaluated by psychiatrists who determined he was a sexual psychopath with little control over his impulses, depression, and what they called inappropriate emotional responses. He was sent to Atascadero State Hospital in California, a facility for mentally disordered offenders. In 1974, after 5 years, he was released. The evaluation that accompanied his release concluded he was no longer a danger to others. He was free 16 months later. He would rape a 14-year-old boy named David McVicker while the boy was hitchhiking home from a friend's house in Garden Grove, California. Bonin raped McVicker but let him go. He was convicted of lewd and lascivious conduct and sentenced to between 1 and 15 years in a California state prison. In October of 1978, after serving 4 years, the California parole system released him again. He was 31 years old. He moved into an apartment in Downey, California, the same suburb his family had come to years before. He found work as a truck driver for a Montebello company called Dependable Drive Away. He had a girlfriend, whom he told acquaintances he visited in Anaheim on Sundays. He attended neighborhood parties thrown by an older man named Everett Fraser, who lived nearby. At those parties, he met a 22-year-old named Vernon Butts, who worked at a factory and performed part-time as a magician. He met a 19-year-old named Gregory Miley, a Texan who was new to Southern California. He was building, without appearing to build, a social world that would later serve a different purpose entirely. Southern California in the late 1970s was a place in flux. The freeway system, one of the largest and most complex in the world, had reshaped the geography of daily life. People moved differently than they had before. The distances between places were vast, and the culture of hitchhiking that had emerged in the 1960s still had a presence, particularly among young people who had no other way to get around. Teenagers hitchhiked, runaways hitchhiked, boys catching rides to see friends, to get to work, to reach the coast. The freeway was a space of transit, a between place, a space that was, in a very real sense, ungoverned, wide open, and moving too fast for anyone to be looking carefully. William Bonin had a van and a lot of time on weekends. It was only a matter of months. The first body was found on August 6, 1979. His name was Marcus Grabs. He was 17 years old, a German exchange student who had been backpacking through the United States. One of those young people who travels with the confidence of someone who has decided that the world is basically good and that people, on the whole, mean well. He was found beside a road near Malibu. He had been sodomized, beaten, and stabbed 77 times. An orange nylon cord was loosely wrapped behind his head. A piece of ignition wire was tied around one ankle. The violence of it was staggering, even to investigators who were accustomed to difficult scenes. 77 stab wounds suggest something beyond calculation, something that had been building for a very long time, finally released in a single terrible event. William Bonin had been out the night before with Vernon Butts. There was, in those early months, no reason for investigators to connect what was happening to a single person. Los Angeles County alone covered thousands of square miles. Orange County bordered it to the south. The bodies appeared across jurisdictions, left on the side of the 210, found behind a gas station in Westminster, discovered beside an industrial complex near the Pacific Coast Highway. Different investigators worked different scenes. Different agencies filed different reports. The silos of law enforcement, which would become a subject of intense critique in the years that followed, were doing exactly what silos do, containing information. By September of 1979, Donald Hayden, 15, had been killed. By October, David Murillo, 17. By November, Dennis Frank Fox, also 17, was found on Ortego Highway in Orange County. By December, Charles Miranda, 15, was found in an alley in Los Angeles. On the same February night in 1980 that Miranda was killed, 12-year-old James McCabe was also murdered. He had been waiting for a bus at the corner of Beach Boulevard and Slater Avenue in Huntington Beach. He was on his way to Disneyland. He accepted an offer of a ride. He was the youngest of all the victims. He was 12 years old going to Disneyland. The manner of the killings, when investigators began to compare notes, showed consistencies. The victims were primarily young males. Most had been hitchhiking or were otherwise accessible, alone, on foot, without immediate witnesses. Many had been encountered near or on freeways. Their bodies were left in locations tied to the freeway system, discarded in ways that suggested familiarity with those routes, with the geography of quick disposal. All of them had been strangled. By early 1980, it was becoming impossible to ignore the connecting thread. A task force was eventually assembled, 6 officers drawn from 3 of the jurisdictions most heavily impacted by the killings. They shared information. They compared photographs and forensic reports. They began, cautiously, to conclude that they were looking for one individual, or perhaps a small group, and that this individual was striking by the spring of 1980 at an average rate of once every 2 weeks. Southern California's gay community was, by this point, particularly alarmed. The profile of the victims, young males, often encountered in areas associated with the gay community, had generated significant anxiety. Leading gay rights advocates raised a reward totaling $50,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever was responsible. The gesture was meaningful in context. In 1980, in California, an organized gay advocacy community putting up $50,000 for a murder investigation was a significant act of both courage and civic concern. It also reflected the degree to which the killings had generated what can only be described as ambient terror, a fear that settled into ordinary life, into the decision of whether to hitchhike, whether to walk alone, whether to accept a ride. William Bonin, during this same period, was going to work. He was talking to co-workers. He was following the news coverage of the freeway killings with what appeared to be the focused interest of a concerned citizen. He told people the killer was embarrassing the community. He was almost certainly telling the truth in his way about the embarrassment. He kept collecting newspaper clippings. He had also, by this point, expanded his network of accomplices. Vernon Butts had participated in at least 6 of the murders. Gregory Miley had participated in several. A 17-year-old named William Ray Pugh, who had met Bonin through their mutual social network, had accompanied Bonin on at least 1 killing. An 18-year-old from Michigan named James Monroe had also been drawn into the van, the nights, the violence. The accomplices are one of the most disturbing and psychologically complex aspects of this case. Bonin was not a typical lone actor. He brought people in. He recruited them, in a sense. Young men who were themselves at various stages of vulnerability, marginalization, or susceptibility. He was older, more confident, more experienced. He provided a sense of belonging that, in his own words recorded after his arrest, he said he never found anywhere else. He once told investigators that his time with his accomplices gave him the feeling of social connection that had eluded him throughout his entire life. The killings were, in some terrible sense, also about that. Community. Shared experience. Belonging. The break came from an unexpected place, as breaks in cases like this often do, not from forensic evidence or investigative brilliance alone, but from a single human conversation overheard at the wrong time. In May of 1980, a 17-year-old named William Ray Pugh had been arrested for auto theft. He was being held at the Los Padrinos Juvenile Courthouse in Los Angeles. On May 28th, he overheard a radio broadcast describing the details of the ongoing freeway killings, the modus operandi of the unknown suspect, the way the victims were picked up, the manner of their deaths. And Pugh recognized it. He had been in the van. He had seen it. He confided in a counselor at the facility that he knew someone who matched everything being described. The counselor did the right thing. She reported the information to the police, who relayed it to LAPD Homicide Detective Sergeant John St. John, a veteran investigator who had spent years working the most difficult cases in Los Angeles. St. John interviewed Pugh the next day. Pugh withheld the detail of his own direct involvement in one of the murders, but he gave St. John enough. A name, a van, a neighborhood, a man who collected newspaper clippings in his glove compartment. At roughly the same time, David McVicker, the 14-year-old Bonin had assaulted in 1975 and released, contacted police to report his own growing suspicion that the man who had attacked him years ago might be the freeway killer. His suspicion was not dismissed, but it was folded into the volume of public tips that investigators were managing at the time. What followed was surveillance. 9 days of it. During those 9 days, plainclothes officers watched William Bonin as he went about his ordinary life. They watched him drive. They watched him stop. They watched him slow down when he passed young men walking alone near the freeway access roads. He was patient. He was careful. He was looking. On June 11, 1980, Bonin spent an evening driving through Hollywood. Officers watched him slow his van and speak to 5 separate young men at different points across the city, attempting to entice them inside. 5 of them declined or walked away. A 6th accepted. The officers moved in. Inside the van, they found a teenage boy who was alive but terrified. Bonin was arrested on suspicion of rape. He was 33 years old. He was charged initially with the rape of a minor and held on suspicion of murder. The bail was set at $250,000. When Bonin's girlfriend called his employer to explain his absence from work, his coworker James Monroe, who had been increasingly anxious about Bonin's behavior, stole Bonin's car and fled back to Michigan, where he was later arrested. The van was searched carefully. What investigators found inside it told a story that required very little interpretation. A forensic examination of William Bonin's 1972 Ford van took time. It was meticulous, careful work, the kind that must be done without urgency precisely because the urgency is so great. What investigators found was extensive. Bloodstains covered the interior, some visible, many requiring chemical detection. There were restraining devices, wire cords, handcuffs, materials that had a practical purpose inside that vehicle and no innocent explanation for their presence there. There were knives. There was a tire iron. The interior door handles had been removed, so that anyone placed in the back of the van could not open the doors from the inside. In the glove compartment, in a small cardboard box, was the scrapbook, newspaper clippings about the freeway killings, organized and kept, a private archive of his own work. Bonin initially denied involvement. This is not unusual. What changed the direction of the interrogations, what cracked the initial silence, was something both expected and deeply human. The mother of Sean King, one of the victims, wrote a letter. She wrote it to the police, but she wrote it as though writing to the person who had taken her son. She asked not for justice, not in those terms. She asked to know where her child was, where his body was. She wanted to bring him home. Sergeant John St. John showed the letter to Bonin. Bonin read it and, over the course of several evenings, confessed. He confessed to 21 murders. He did so without remorse. Investigators who were present noted afterward that he showed no grief, no apparent regret, no sign of the weight of what he was saying. What he expressed, almost uniformly, was embarrassment. He was embarrassed at having been caught. When asked, in a later interview, what he would be doing if he were still free, Bonin answered with a directness that made the room quiet. "I'd still be killing," he said. "I couldn't stop killing." The trial, or rather, the trials, began in October of 1981. Bonin faced charges across 2 counties. Los Angeles County would try him first for 10 murders. Those of Marcus Grabbs, Donald Hayden, David Murillo, Charles Miranda, James McCabe, Ronald Gatlin, Harry Todd Turner, Stephen Wood, Darren Lee Kendrick, and Stephen J. Wells. The Orange County trial would follow, for 4 additional victims: Dennis Frank Fox, Glenn Barker, Russell Rue, and Lawrence Sharp. The courtroom proceedings were lengthy, complicated, and at times strained under the weight of what was being presented. Jury selection alone was a protracted process. The media coverage had been extensive enough, and the nature of the crime specific enough that finding jurors who had no prior opinion required significant effort. The defense, led by attorney William Charvet, attempted to construct a narrative around trauma and circumstance. Vietnam was raised. Childhood abuse was raised. The argument, in essence, was that William Bonin was himself a product of harm, that his violence was the logical terminus of a life in which violence had been done to him, repeatedly from the beginning. It was not an argument without truth. The childhood was real. The abuse was documented. The institutional failures were on record. But the testimony of Bonin's own family members, who described no meaningful change in him after his return from Vietnam, undermined the centrality of that particular explanation. And the defense's argument, however sincere, came up against the unnavigable fact that the jury had heard testimony about 21 human beings, about a 12-year-old on his way to Disneyland, about a German student backpacking through America, about teenager after teenager who had simply trusted the wrong person. There were also the accomplices. Vernon Butts had agreed to testify. He was facing charges himself. He had been present for and active in at least 6 of the murders. But Butts did not make it to trial. In 1982, while being held at the Los Angeles County Jail awaiting court proceedings, he died by suicide. He was 23 years old. His death removed a key witness, though the prosecution had amassed sufficient evidence from other sources, from Bonin's own confession, and from James Monroe's testimony. Monroe, who had been present for at least one murder and had fled to Michigan after Bonin's arrest, was arrested and returned to California. He testified against Bonin in exchange for a negotiated sentence. His testimony was detailed and intimate in the way that testimony from someone who was present always is. He described the van, the night, the decisions made in real time by a man who had made such decisions many times before. William Ray Pugh, the teenager whose overheard conversation had ultimately broken the case, was charged with voluntary manslaughter for his role in the killing of Harry Todd Turner. He received a sentence of 6 years, though he remained incarcerated significantly longer. Gregory Miley, who had participated in at least 2 of the murders and had been present for others, received a sentence of 25 years to life for his role. In January of 1982, after a trial that had lasted months, the jury in the Los Angeles case delivered their verdict. Bonin was convicted on all 10 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstance findings on each findings that made him eligible for California's death penalty. The jury fixed the sentence at death. He was formally sentenced in March of 1982. A year later, the Orange County trial reached the same conclusion. For more murders, for more convictions, a second death sentence. The prosecutor at the first trial, in a statement that became widely quoted, described Bonin as the most arch-evil person who had ever existed. It was an extreme statement, the kind that courthouse rhetoric occasionally produces, but it reflected something real about the emotional register of the proceedings. The accumulated weight of what had been presented, victim by victim, week after week. The press coverage was intense. This was, by any measure, one of the highest-profile criminal cases in California's history, and it coincided with a period in which Californians, and Americans more broadly, were beginning to seriously grapple with the phenomenon of serial murder as a distinct category, as a pattern that demanded systemic response. What Bonin's case made impossible to ignore was the system. Not just the man. The system that had looked at him in 1974 and said, "No longer a danger." The system that had looked at him in 1978 and said, "No longer a danger." The system that had released him twice into proximity with young men and boys without adequate supervision or support. That part of the story, which should have been front and center, was often overshadowed by the gravity of the crimes themselves. But it was there, and it refused to be entirely quiet. Death row at San Quentin State Prison sits on a peninsula in San Francisco Bay. The water is cold there, and the wind comes in off the Pacific with a flatness that gives the place a particular quality of light, gray-white, diffuse, the kind that shows everything and softens nothing. William Bonin arrived at San Quentin in 1982 and spent the next 14 years there. He occupied a cell on death row measuring 6 by 9 feet. He gave interviews to journalists and researchers. He corresponded by letter. He wrote, at one point, a collection of short stories that was published under the title Doing Time in 1991. He maintained, in various conversations, that he had not committed some of the murders attributed to him while freely admitting to others. He appealed his convictions through multiple rounds of the California legal system and ultimately to the United States Supreme Court, which declined to intervene. He never expressed remorse. This was consistent across every documented interaction: interviews, depositions, letters. The embarrassment he had shown at being caught never resolved into anything that resembled regret for the harm itself. The 1980s and 1990s in California were a period of significant debate about capital punishment. Public opinion had shifted over time, and the legal landscape had shifted with it. A federal judge ruled in 1994 that California's gas chamber constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, given the likelihood that a person would experience pain before losing consciousness. Lethal injection was adopted as the alternative method. William Bonin became the first California inmate to be executed by lethal injection. On February 23, 1996, at San Quentin State Prison, at the age of 49, he was pronounced dead. Outside the prison walls, protesters on both sides of the capital punishment debate had gathered, some holding candles, some holding signs, some watching in silence as the night arrived over the bay. In his final statement, which he composed in writing, Bonin offered advice. He suggested that anyone who was contemplating breaking the law should go somewhere quiet and think about it seriously. He said he did not believe the death penalty was the answer to society's problems. He said nothing about the 21 people he had confessed to killing. He said nothing to their families. The families, by that point, had been living with the absence of their sons for 15 to 17 years. Marcus Grab's family was in Germany. The McVickers, David McVicker, who had survived the 1975 attack and lived with the knowledge of what might have happened, and what eventually did happen to others, continued in Southern California, carrying a particular kind of weight that comes with having escaped what others could not. Sean King's mother, whose letter had broken open Bonin's silence, received word of where her son's body had been discarded. That is a sentence that takes a moment to fully land. A mother who had to write a letter to a murderer to find out where her child's body was. The families of the victims were not, by and large, consulted in the shaping of the narrative that followed. They appear in the court records, they appear briefly in the news coverage, and then the machinery of true crime, of public fascination, of documentary and book and podcast, largely moves through their grief without stopping. This is worth noting, because the story of William Bonin is also, and perhaps primarily, the story of those families. Of Marcus Grab's family learning, from across an ocean, that their son would not be coming home. Of Glenn Barker's family, who lost a 14-year-old. Of James McCabe's family, who sent a 12-year-old to catch a bus. The accomplices' stories continued after the trial. Vernon Butts, as noted, had died in jail in 1982. Gregory Miley, who had received 25 years to life, was killed in 2016 by another inmate at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. He was in his mid-50s. William Ray Pugh remained incarcerated as recently as 2019, decades beyond his original sentence. James Monroe, who had received 15 years to life for his cooperation and role in the crimes, also remained incarcerated. The fate of the accomplices, all of them young at the time, the youngest 17, raises its own difficult questions. At what age does participation in violence become full moral culpability? At what point does manipulation by an older, predatory figure become its own kind of harm? These are not rhetorical questions. They are questions that the legal system answered one way and that ethicists and psychologists have, in the years since, continued to complicate. There is another dimension to this case that deserves more attention than it typically receives. William Bonin was not, technically, the only person operating under the name the Freeway Killer. In Southern California in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were actually 3 distinct killers whose crimes were initially grouped under that umbrella designation before investigators untangled the separate strands. Patrick Kearney was one of them, convicted in 1977. Randy Kraft was another, a computer analyst who was arrested in May of 1983 and is currently on death row. having been convicted of 16 murders, with investigators linking him to additional crimes that may number in the dozens. The coexistence of these three killers, operating simultaneously or near simultaneously in the same geographic region, leaving bodies in similar locations, creating a blurred and terrifying picture for investigators trying to find a single suspect, is one of the more haunting details of the entire case. A police chart later revealed by journalists, labeled the Southern California Stranglers, showed that investigators had known since early 1978 that a prolific killer or killers was active in the region. It also, according to those who saw it after Bonin's arrest, revealed that the existence of a second active killer, Randy Kraft, had been concealed in the public accounting of the case. The full picture of what happened on those freeways across those years has never been entirely satisfyingly assembled. What did change as a direct result of the Bonin case and cases like it was the institutional conversation about parole and recidivism among violent sexual offenders. The question of how a man could be released from psychiatric custody in 1974 with a determination that he was no longer dangerous, then rape a 14-year-old within 16 months, then be released again in 1978 with an 18-month probation order, then begin killing within 8 months. That question was asked loudly, in legislative chambers and newspaper editorials and academic papers, in the years following Bonin's conviction. It contributed to a broader national reckoning with how the justice system evaluated, managed, and released individuals with histories of sexual violence. California's laws around sexually violent predators were significantly amended in subsequent years. The conversation around the inadequacy of simple psychiatric evaluation as a basis for release gained substantial traction. None of it brought anyone back, but it represented the kind of hard-won, grief-purchased knowledge that sometimes, not always, but sometimes produces change. David McVicker, the 14-year-old who had been assaulted by Bonin in 1975 and who had ultimately contacted police with his suspicions, gave interviews about his experience in the decades following the case. He described the moment he was picked up in Garden Grove, heading home to Huntington Beach, with the matter-of-fact clarity that some survivors develop. Not to diminish what happened, but because matter-of-fact clarity is the only way to say something true about a thing that should not have happened at all. He said he had been hitchhiking. He said it was the last day of summer. He said Bonin offered him a ride. He survived. He went on to live his life. There are 14 young men and boys, at minimum, who did not get to do that. What do we do with a story like this? That is not a rhetorical question either. It is the actual question, the one that sits at the center of every true crime account that takes its subject seriously. We document. We name the victims, not only the perpetrator. We hold the institutional failures clearly in view, not to deflect blame but because those failures are the mechanism by which harm was multiplied. We resist the seduction of the monstrous, the tendency to locate evil in a single, extraordinary figure and close the file. Because what the Bonin case actually shows is not the extraordinary. It shows the ordinary, the child left in the care of someone who would harm him. The boy returned from one institution into another. The young man released by a system that looked at documented violence and said twice that it had been resolved. The freeway runs through all of it, not as metaphor, as geography, as the actual physical space where something that could have been stopped was not. William George Bonin was executed on February 23, 1996, at San Quentin State Prison. He was 49 years old. He was the first person in California executed by lethal injection. He left behind no expression of remorse. He left behind questions about the full scope of his crimes that have never been definitively answered. He confessed to 21 murders. He was convicted of 14. The actual number may be higher. He left behind 14 families who buried their sons. He left behind one man, David McVicker, who was 14 years old on a September night in 1975 and who was still in the world decades later because Bonin made a different decision that night than he made every other time. He left behind a stretch of Southern California freeway that looks, in daylight, like every other stretch of freeway, ordinary and unremarkable, moving and wide and full of people going somewhere. The ordinary, as it turns out, is the place that requires the most careful attention. That is the part of this story that has not yet been fully resolved. And perhaps that is the part we carry forward. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Man Who Called Himself a Hustler. The story of Gary Ray Bowles, the I-95 killer. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a life before it collapses entirely. Not a peaceful quiet. Not the kind you feel at the end of a long day when the house finally goes still and the world outside softens into something manageable. This is a different kind. A held-breath quiet. The kind that exists in the moment between a door clicking shut and the realization that nobody on the other side is coming back. Gary Ray Bowles understood that quiet very well. He had been living inside it for most of his life. Since before he had words for it. Since before he understood that the bruises he carried as a child were not something every child carried. He had grown up in a home where the loudest sounds were the worst ones, and silence, however brief, was the only shelter available. By the time he was 14 years old and standing on a street he did not recognize, with nothing in his pockets and nowhere particular to go, the quiet had become his companion. Not a welcome one, just a familiar one. What happened between that 14-year-old boy and the 32-year-old man who would eventually appear on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list is a story that resists easy explanation. It is not a story of pure evil, neatly packaged and delivered for the comfort of those who need their monsters to be obviously monstrous from the start. It is something more complicated and, in many ways, more troubling than that. It is the story of a man shaped by forces that began working on him long before he had any capacity to resist them, and then a man who, at a point where choices were still theoretically possible, made choices that ended the lives of 6 other human beings. This is not a story told to frighten you. It is told as carefully and as honestly as the facts allow, because the men who died along the Interstate 95 corridor in 1994 deserve to be more than footnotes in a crime statistic. Because the case itself raised questions about how investigators coordinate across state lines, how courts weigh motive, and how a justice system sometimes takes 25 years to arrive at an outcome. And because in the final hours of his life, Gary Ray Bowles wrote a letter to his mother in which he said something that stayed with people long after the execution was over. He said, "You don't wake up one day and decide to become a serial killer." Whether that is a statement of psychological truth, a plea for understanding, or simply the last defense of a man with no defenses left. That, perhaps, is the most honest question this story asks you to sit with. Gary Ray Bowles was born on January 25, 1962, in Clifton Forge, Virginia, a small mill and rail town tucked into the Allegheny Highlands. The mountains there are old and close together, and the communities that grew between them were built on the kind of labor that leaves marks on the body: coal, steel, rail. His father, William Franklin Bowles, worked in that world. He was a coal miner. He never got the chance to hold his youngest son, because he died of black lung disease before Gary was even born. William Bowles left behind a widow, Frances Carroll Price Bowles, and the particular kind of grief that comes with raising children alone in a place where resources are thin and options thinner. What happened next was not unusual for the time and place. Frances remarried. Then she remarried again. The men she chose, or the men who chose her, or some combination of both, as these things always are, brought with them the kind of chaos that does not announce itself all at once. It arrives gradually, installing itself into the rhythms of a household until violence becomes as ordinary as the dinner table. Gary's first stepfather was physically abusive. Not occasionally, routinely. He beat the boys with his belt and his fists, and when Frances tried to intervene, she absorbed the same punishment. Eventually, she left him. The relief of that departure did not last. The next man, a man named Chet, brought alcohol into the house, along with a temper that the alcohol seemed to unlock rather than create. He was a frequent and violent presence. Frances was hospitalized more than once during the years of that marriage. The boys were beaten. The house was loud in the worst ways and silent in the worst ways, in alternating cycles that left no room for anything as simple as feeling safe. Gary was around 7 or 8 years old when the abuse began in earnest. By the time he reached his early teenage years, he had absorbed enough violence to have internalized its grammar, the logic that strength is expressed through harm, that emotional pain finds its exit through physical action. He dropped out of school during the 8th grade. He was 13, maybe 14, when he and his brother decided they had endured enough. The two of them turned on their stepfather one evening and beat him badly enough that the dynamic in the house shifted permanently. For Gary, though, the aftermath wasn't liberation. It was an impossible situation. He could not stay in a home where he felt nothing was better for him. And so he left. Walking away from a violent household at 14 is not, on its own, an act of courage in the triumphant sense. It is an act of desperation. Gary Bowles left with no plan, no money, no completed education, and no reliable adult in his corner. He survived, as many young people in that situation survive, by finding an economy that would accept him as he was. He turned to sex work. Specifically, he allowed older men to perform sex acts on him in exchange for money. He would later, and consistently, maintain that he was not gay. Investigators who spoke with him over the years described his self-identification not as homosexual but as something he himself called a hustler. The distinction mattered to him deeply, in ways that would later become tragically relevant. He was not interested in men romantically or sexually, by his own account. He was interested in survival, and the market he found himself in as a young, able-bodied man without options was the one available to him. This is not said to excuse anything that came later. It is said because context shapes everything, and leaving it out would make what followed less comprehensible, not more so. Gary Bowles did not spring fully formed from nowhere. He was made, slowly and with some thoroughness, by a childhood that offered him very little in the way of stability, safety, or models of functional human behavior. Through his late teens and early 20s, he drifted. He spent time in West Virginia, in Florida, across various stretches of the American South. He had relationships with women. He was genuinely drawn to women, and the women he was with remembered him as charming in some ways, volatile in others. He maintained a double life that was not especially unusual among men who hustled for money, presenting as straight in his personal relationships while engaging in transactional sexual contact with men as a means of income. It was a common enough arrangement. It was also one that required constant management of identity, constant compartmentalization, and what investigators and psychologists who studied his case later described as a deep and festering resentment, not only toward the violence of his childhood, but toward the men whose company had become his primary economic reality. By the early 1980s, Gary was living in Tampa, Florida. He was in his early 20s. He had a girlfriend, a young woman who by all accounts was involved with him genuinely. In June of 1982, whatever pressure had been building inside Gary Bowles reached an early and terrible expression. He attacked her. The assault was severe. She survived with significant injuries, bruising consistent with choking, facial injuries that left her eyes swollen shut, internal injuries that required medical attention. The state of Florida charged him, and he was convicted of beating and sexually assaulting her. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He served a portion of that time before his release. The years between his first imprisonment and 1994 added more texture to the record without changing its fundamental direction. By the early 1990s, he was back in Florida, living in Daytona Beach with a woman he had become close to. She became pregnant. Then she discovered that he had been sleeping with men for money. The pregnancy ended. She had an abortion. Gary Bowles, by his own account to police, translated his grief and rage at that moment into a specific target. He told investigators that he blamed gay men for what had happened. The logic was not logical. It was the logic of a person in acute psychological pain looking for a container to put it in. That he chose that container, that he arrived at that specific hatred and that specific misdirection, is a fact, and it is also a warning about what happens when unprocessed trauma is finally given a direction to go. In 1991, he had been convicted again. He pushed an elderly woman down and stole her purse in a robbery that was as mundane as it was sad. He was sentenced to 4 more years. He served 2. He came back out into the world in 1993, no steadier than before. By the early months of 1994, Gary Ray Bowles was 32 years old, living without a permanent address, surviving in the way he had always survived, moving through bars and borrowed rooms along the Florida coast. He was, by many accounts, physically striking, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of presence that attracted attention in a room. He was also, beneath the surface of that presence, a man in whom something had been building for a very long time. The gay bars he frequented along the Atlantic coast were not places he went out of desire. They were, to him, a labor market, and the men who met him there, older, often lonely, often generous, had no way of knowing what they were inviting into their lives when they offered him a drink, a conversation, a place to stay. John Hardy Roberts was 59 years old. He was a single insurance salesman originally from Tennessee. He was a man who wanted companionship, who was looking, as many people are, quietly and without drama, for something that resembled a genuine connection. He met Gary Bowles at a popular gay bar in Daytona Beach sometime in March of 1994. He offered him a place to stay. He had a beachfront home. He was kind. That is how 1994 began. And it is where the story shifts into something that no amount of context makes easy to sit with. John Hardy Roberts welcomed Gary Ray Bowles into his home in mid-March of 1994. What followed was not immediate. There was a period of days in which the two men coexisted. Bowles staying in the house, talking often about an ex-girlfriend, a topic that frustrated Roberts and made clear to him that this arrangement was more complicated than he had hoped. Roberts was a man who seems, from what investigators and reporters pieced together afterward, to have wanted something real. Bowles was a man who wanted somewhere to sleep and someone to provide it. On March 14, 1994, Roberts gave Bowles an ultimatum. Whatever precisely was said between the two men in that conversation is known only through Bowles's later account to police, which carried the usual limitations of any self-reported version of events. But the broad shape is established. Roberts told Bowles to make a decision, to commit in some fashion or to leave. Bowles responded with violence. He struck Roberts with a lamp. He beat him. He strangled him. John Hardy Roberts, who had opened his door and offered a stranger the basic dignities of shelter and companionship, did not survive the night. Bowles took Roberts's car. He took Roberts's credit card. He left Daytona Beach and moved north. Police discovered the scene when a friend, unable to reach Roberts for more than a day, broke into the home and found what the violence had left behind. Investigators processed the scene and found, among other evidence, a probation paper, a physical document with Gary Bowles's name on it. They also found fingerprints. They ran them. They matched a record. Within a short time, Gary Ray Bowles was a named suspect in the murder of John Hardy Roberts. But he was already gone, somewhere up the coast, using a dead man's credit card to move through the country. The card was used in Kingsland, Georgia, then in Nashville, Tennessee. The trail was real, but the man was moving. In the weeks that followed, Bowles made his way to Washington, D.C., and into the neighborhoods of DuPont Circle, at that time, one of the more visible and active gay communities on the East Coast. He was working in the way he had always worked, finding men at bars, presenting himself, allowing an exchange to develop. He met David Allen Jarman, 39 years old, a loan officer. Witnesses at the bar saw them leave together. The following morning, April 14, 1994, Jarman's body was found in his home in Montgomery County, Maryland. He had been beaten and strangled. Two victims now. Two men who had made the same gesture, welcome, and received the same consequence. The connection between the cases was not immediately obvious to the separate jurisdictions involved. Daytona Beach, Florida. Montgomery County, Maryland. These were different police departments, different filing systems, different detective units. Interstate cooperation existed in 1994, but it was not instantaneous and it was not seamless. Evidence took time to travel. Identifications took time to confirm. While investigators worked, Gary Bowles moved again. He turned south. He appeared in Savannah, Georgia. On May 5, 1994, a worker at a golf course near the city discovered a body beside a maintenance shed. The victim was Milton Bradley, 72 years old, a World War II veteran who had served his country and carried a shrapnel wound from that service for the rest of his life. He had later undergone a lobotomy. He was disabled. He was described by a detective who knew him personally as a kind and gentle man who spent his time feeding pigeons in the park and helping out at his family's locksmith shop. He was a regular at a gay bar in Savannah called Faces. He had been seen there with Gary Bowles on multiple occasions in the days before his death. He had offered Bowles a ride. Bowles drove them not to Bradley's home but to the golf course, where he killed him. The scene was notable for what investigators described as its excessive violence, what detectives call overkill, the use of force well beyond what would be necessary to cause death. This detail, quietly, was significant, not merely because of what it suggested about the emotional state of the perpetrator during the act, but because it formed part of a pattern. Each scene, each victim, each time a quality of rage that seemed to exceed any rational purpose. 8 days after the discovery of Bradley's body, another man was found dead in Atlanta. Alverson Carter Jr., 47 years old, stabbed. The cases were now accumulating across multiple states, Florida, Maryland, Georgia, and investigators were beginning to compare notes. Jim Hardy, an assistant state attorney in Jacksonville, noted publicly at the time that the murders showed consistent patterns across jurisdictions. Bowles' name was attached to the Florida cases. His fingerprints from Savannah were run and matched. Slowly, the picture assembled itself. On May 19, 1994, a fifth body was found in Hilliard, Florida, in Nassau County. Albert Alcee Morris, 37 years old, had met Bowles at a bar and let him stay in his house for about a week. Morris's parents found their son. He had been beaten with a marble dish, shot in the chest, and a towel had been stuffed into his mouth. Again, that signature, the stuffed mouth. Investigators would later reflect on what this detail said about the killer. Whether it was about silencing, about control, about some psychological compulsion that repeated itself across scenes that were otherwise separated by hundreds of miles. By late May and early June of 1994, law enforcement had Gary Ray Bowles' name, his photograph, his fingerprints, and a pattern that connected him to 5 murders across 4 states. His image was placed in front of the public. His name began appearing in newspapers, and then, for months, he seemed to vanish. He did not vanish. He assumed an identity. Using a pay stub belonging to a day laborer named Timothy Whitfield, Bowles reinvented himself. He went by Whitfield's name. He used variations of other identities he had accumulated over years of transient living. Investigators would later establish that he had used 5 different social security numbers and multiple aliases, including Gary Ray Bowles and Joey Pearson. He worked day labor jobs. He was arrested at one point for minor infractions under the Whitfield identity and served brief jail time without being flagged. He was, in effect, hiding in plain sight in a country in which cross-referencing of identities was still largely manual and slow. The gap was real and it was costly. The murders had stopped, or appeared to have stopped. The media attention began to recede. Other stories filled the news cycle. The task force that had formed around the I-95 killings maintained its work, but without new activity, public urgency diminished. Then, on November 19, 1994, 3 days after Gary Ray Bowles was officially added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, something broke open. And it happened in Jacksonville, Florida, where a man named Walter Jamel Hinton did not show up for work at a flower shop, and his sister went to his apartment to find out why. Walter Jamel Hinton was 47 years old. He had a job he showed up to. He had a sister who noticed when he didn't. He had a life that, from the outside, showed the ordinary texture of a person moving through their days with purpose and connection. When his sister arrived at his apartment and found what was inside, the investigation that had been stalled for months broke open again with the weight of everything it had been accumulating. Hinton had been killed in a manner consistent with the other murders. Strangled, something forced into his mouth, violence applied with what the prosecutor who would later try the case called unmistakable deliberateness. A 40-pound concrete stepping stone had been used to strike him while he slept. The Jacksonville investigators initially did not immediately connect it to Bowles, because the I-95 killer had been off the active radar for several months by that point. The connection came shortly after, when investigators at the scene found a pay stub. Not for Timothy Whitfield this time, but a document that led back through the web of aliases Bowles had been constructing. Detectives made calls. They circulated a description. They asked employment offices to watch for a man matching a certain profile. He appeared. Gary Ray Bowles walked into an employment office in Jacksonville looking for day labor, and the people there had been told to look for someone matching his description. Law enforcement was called. He was brought in. He was questioned. And in the room where that questioning happened, Gary Ray Bowles, who had been running for the better part of 8 months, stopped running. He confessed. Not reluctantly, not after extended legal maneuvering. He told investigators what he had done, case by case, victim by victim. When asked later why he had confessed, he said something that stayed with the detectives who heard it. He said, "So the killing would stop." And then he added, "I didn't want to kill nobody. But I did. I don't know why." That admission, frank, disoriented, genuinely confused, posed a question that would follow the case through years of litigation. It was not the statement of a man performing remorse for strategic gain. It sounded, to many who heard it, like the statement of a man who had arrived at the end of something and couldn't fully account for the road that had brought him there. The legal process that followed was long and layered. In May of 1996, Bowles pleaded guilty to the murder of Walter Hinton in Jacksonville. He was sentenced to death. In 1997, he pleaded guilty to 2 additional murders, John Hardy Roberts and 1 other, and received 2 consecutive life sentences. At the sentencing hearing, the state attorney, Bernie de la Rionda, argued that Bowles had been motivated by a combination of financial gain and hatred of gay men. It was a prosecutorial theory grounded in Bowles's own statements to investigators about the abortion his girlfriend had, his subsequent redirection of grief and rage onto gay men, and the pattern of behavior across the murders. The jury heard that argument. They returned a sentence of death. Then came the appeal. In 1998, the Florida Supreme Court reviewed the case and found that the trial court had erred. The error was specific, allowing the jury to hear the prosecution's theory that Bowles hated gay men had, in the court's determination, prejudiced the trial. The question of whether motive, particularly motive rooted in bias, is admissible at sentencing, and in what form, was not settled law at the time in Florida. The death sentence was reversed. Bowles remained in custody. A new sentencing hearing was scheduled. This overturning produced real consternation among families of the victims, among investigators who had worked the case, and among advocates for the gay community who had watched 6 men die and then watched a court introduce what felt to many like a legal technicality between a conviction and its consequence. The law does not always feel just, even when it is operating as designed. It is worth saying clearly that the Florida Supreme Court's decision was not a finding of innocence, was not a questioning of Bowles's guilt, and was not a statement about the humanity of the victims. It was a ruling on procedural fairness. It was also, to those who had waited years for accountability, deeply painful. In 1999, a second jury was convened for the sentencing phase. They deliberated for less than an hour. They returned the same verdict: death. Gary Ray Bowles was returned to death row at Florida State Prison near Rayford, where he would remain for the next 2 decades. The men who had worked the case moved on to other cases. The families of the victims moved on in whatever way families move on when justice has been served, but the loss remains permanent. For 20 years, the case existed in that particular suspended state that death row cases occupy, neither resolved nor active, technically concluded but humanly open, the way these things always are. There is something worth noting about the victims here, individually and as a group, that tends to get compressed in the summary telling of the case. John Hardy Roberts was a Tennessee man looking for love in his late 50s. David Jarman was a lone officer whose colleagues remembered him as organized and reliable. Milton Bradley was a war veteran who had survived things most people never face and spent his later years in quiet service to his neighborhood. Alverson Carter Jr. had a life in Atlanta with people who noticed his absence. Albert Morris had parents who found him. Walter Hinton had a sister who came looking when he didn't show up. Each of them was more than a victim. Each of them was a person with a full interior life, with a history, with people who loved them. They were targeted not because of anything they did or any fault in their character, but because of who they were and because a man with unresolved trauma and a direction for his rage happened to move through the same bars they frequented. The randomness of that intersection, the sheer contingency of it, is one of the things about violent crime that never becomes entirely comfortable to contemplate. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Gary Ray Bowles' death warrant on June 11, 2019. By then, Bowles had spent 20 years on death row. He was 57 years old. His lawyers filed a final round of appeals, including arguments to both the Florida Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court. The central argument in those final appeals was that Bowles had an intellectual disability and was therefore constitutionally protected from execution under the Supreme Court's 2002 ruling in Atkins v. Virginia. Both courts denied the appeals. The execution was scheduled for 6 o'clock in the evening on August 22, 2019. The delay caused by the final appeals pushed the actual time back by several hours. At 10:58 p.m., Gary Ray Bowles was administered a lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was the 99th person executed in Florida since the state resumed use of the death penalty in 1976. Before his death, Bowles ate a last meal: 3 cheeseburgers, French fries, and bacon. He had prepared a 2-page written statement that was given to the media after the execution was completed. Most of the statement was addressed to his mother. It was not defiant. It was not calculating. It was the letter of a man trying to say something honest in the last space available to him, knowing that the words would carry weight precisely because they were final. He apologized to the families of his victims. He told his mother he was sorry for what she had endured, not only for the crimes themselves but for the particular suffering of having your child described publicly, repeatedly, and accurately as a monster. He acknowledged that description. He did not dispute it. He asked her to believe that he had not wanted this to be his life. And he said the thing that has stayed in the record of this case ever since, the thing that reporters quoted and commentators parsed and victims' families received in silence. You don't wake up one day and decide to become a serial killer. The families of the victims were not, in many cases, alive to receive the final outcome. The prosecution noted with some sorrow that the mother and sister of Walter Hinton had both died in the years the case spent working through the courts. This is one of the less discussed dimensions of the time these cases take, that the people most directly harmed by the violence sometimes do not live to see the legal conclusion. The weight itself is a form of continued injury. Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, who had prosecuted Bowles more than 2 decades earlier and who was present for the execution, described the length of the process with restrained grief. "It has taken so long to get where we are at," he said. The case of Gary Ray Bowles leaves several kinds of legacy, not all of them straightforward to articulate. The first is procedural. The I-95 murders of 1994 are studied in law enforcement training contexts as a case that illustrated, with tragic clarity, the limitations of cross-jurisdictional murder investigations in the pre-digital era. 6 murders happened across 4 states over 8 months, and the failure to connect them earlier was not the result of negligence, but of structural gaps. Separate databases, separate filing protocols, the simple logistical difficulty of sharing physical evidence and photograph comparisons across departments that had no shared digital infrastructure. The case helped accelerate conversations about interstate communication protocols that eventually led to improvements in how law enforcement agencies share suspect information. It is a grim form of progress, but it is progress. The second legacy is sociological. The men Gary Bowles killed were targeted in gay bars, in a period when gay men in America occupied a particularly exposed social position. The AIDS crisis had been devastating communities for more than a decade. Anti-gay violence was common and underreported. The relationship between gay communities and law enforcement was, in many cities, tense at best. In that environment, the murders of 6 gay men along the East Coast did not receive, in their initial stages, the level of public urgency that comparable murders of heterosexual victims might have received. This is a difficult observation and a contested one, but it is one that journalists, advocates, and scholars who examine the case have raised consistently. The families of the victims and the detectives who worked their cases did everything within their professional capacity. The question is a larger one, about whose deaths are treated as national emergencies and whose are treated as regional incidents. The third legacy is psychological, and it is perhaps the hardest to resolve. Gary Ray Bowles grew up in conditions that are recognized by researchers in developmental psychology and criminology as risk factors for later violence. Early childhood abuse, parental loss, educational disruption, homelessness in adolescence, entry into survival sex work before the age of 15. None of these factors determined what he became. Millions of people experience adverse childhoods and do not become violent. The research on this is clear and it is important. Trauma explains without excusing, context informs without pardoning. What Gary Bowles did to 6 men in 1994 was not the inevitable product of his childhood. It was a series of choices, each one made in the presence of other possible choices. And yet, the complete absence of any support structure, any intervention, any system that might have reached a 14-year-old boy standing on a street with nowhere to go, that absence matters too. Not as an excuse, as a question worth taking seriously about what a society owes to the children it produces and then fails to catch. There is also a remaining question that the case never fully resolved. Bowles insisted until the end that he had killed 7 men, not 6. He described a 7th murder that predated the 1994 spree, one that, he said, had helped him understand what he was capable of. The FBI reviewed his claim. The state of Florida declined to formally investigate it. No additional murder was officially attributed to him. The claim exists in the record, unverified and uninvestigated, a thread that hangs without resolution. The I-95 corridor, the long spine of the American East Coast, runs through all of this. Through Daytona Beach and Jacksonville and Savannah and Atlanta and the Maryland suburbs of Washington. Through bars where people went looking for connection and found instead the particular randomness that makes violent crime so difficult to metabolize rationally. Through decades of legal proceedings and a final evening in August of 2019 when a 57-year-old man in a cell at Florida State Prison ordered cheeseburgers and wrote a letter to his mother and was put to death by the state he had terrorized a quarter-century before. The 6 men whose lives ended in 1994 were John Hardy Roberts, David Allen Jarman, Milton Bradley, Alverson Carter Jr. Albert Elsie Morris, Walter Jamel Hinton. They are named here not as a ritual gesture, but because their names are the most important information in this story. Not the killer's name, not the legal machinery that processed his guilt, not the psychology of his childhood or the geography of his movements or the question his final letter left hanging. Their names, they deserve to be spoken, they deserve to be remembered. And in the particular quiet of wherever you are listening to this, in whatever space you have made for yourself tonight, wherever you have settled in to be still for a while, it seems right to leave them with you, not as horror, not as spectacle, as human beings who were here and who mattered and who were lost and who are not forgotten. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Man Who Came Home. There is a particular kind of danger that wears a familiar face. It does not arrive with warning signs posted on its chest. It does not announce itself at the door. It moves quietly through neighborhoods, takes jobs alongside people, shares small talk over lunch, and in every visible way appears to be exactly what it claims to be. Someone trying to make a fresh start. That is the version of the story people around it choose to believe, partly because believing otherwise is uncomfortable, and partly because the alternative forces a question no one really wants to sit with. What do we do with a person who has already proven what they are capable of, and yet walks free among us anyway? This is not a hypothetical question. This is a question that the state of North Carolina answered, quietly on a February morning in 2013, when a man named James Opleton Bradley walked out of prison after serving 23 years for the murder of an 8-year-old child. He stepped into the winter air of a world that had moved on without him. He found work. He made connections. He built a routine. And within months of his release, 2 women were dead. What you are about to hear is not a story of a monster hiding in the shadows. It is something more unsettling than that. It is the story of a system that knew exactly who James Bradley was, released him anyway, and then watched too slowly as the consequences of that decision settled over the lives of women who never got to know how much danger they were in. It is also the story of 3 individuals whose lives were taken from them at different points in time, under different circumstances, by the same pair of hands. One of them was a child. 2 of them were women who believed they were safe. This story does not have a satisfying ending. It has a legal conclusion, and a man behind bars, and a family still searching a field somewhere in North Carolina for a woman whose body was never found. Those are different things. Knowing the difference matters. So settle in. Let the night be quiet around you. And listen carefully, because the details in this case are the kind that stay with you. Not because they are loud, but because they are so very, very ordinary. Fayetteville, North Carolina, has always carried the particular weight of a military town. Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, sits at its edge like a second city, pulling people in from across the country, shaping the rhythms of daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. It is a place of transience and structure simultaneously, where people cycle through on orders and assignments, where families are built in short windows, and where community ties can be both tight and surprisingly thin. James Opleton Bradley was born on September 8, 1962, in North Carolina. By the time the events of this story begin, he had become an Army sergeant, a man shaped by the discipline and hierarchy of military service. He had also, somewhere along the way, become a stepfather. His stepdaughter was 8 years old. Her name was Elisa Ivy Gibson, and she went by Ivy. On June 9, 1988, James Bradley called police to report that Ivy had been abducted. He said she had been walking home from her school bus stop, a routine she made regularly, when someone had taken her. He described the scene with enough detail to be convincing. Officers arrived, took the report, and began searching. For 2 days, the community held its breath the way communities do when a child goes missing, with a mixture of hope and a dread that grows heavier with each passing hour. Bradley, in those 2 days, was the grieving stepfather. He spoke with investigators. He gave statements. He appeared to those around him like a man in pain. But detectives noticed things. The scene at the bus stop did not look quite right. There were inconsistencies in his account. Small things, the kind that an untrained eye might dismiss, but that investigators are trained to look for and hold on to. The story, under pressure, began to show its edges. On the second day, Bradley confessed. What he described was not a kidnapping. It was not a stranger. It was an afternoon in a house where a man was homesick, trying to sleep, and a child. His child, in every practical sense, had turned the television up too loud. He said he snapped. He beat Ivy. He wrapped a nylon sock around her neck and strangled her. Then, realizing she was dead, he placed her small body in a garbage bag and drove to the local dump, where he left her. She was found days later in a landfill. The town of Fayetteville absorbed this information the way towns absorb terrible things, with shock, with grief, and then with the slow, inevitable movement of time carrying everyone forward. On January 22, 1990, James Opleton Bradley pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Cumberland County. He was sentenced to life in prison. Because the crime occurred before North Carolina's Structured Sentencing Act came into effect, the sentence carried with it the possibility of parole. That detail in 1990 probably seemed abstract. It was filed in the paperwork and forgotten by most people who had not been close to Ivy Gibson, whose life had lasted only 8 years. Ivy's family did not forget, but the system moved at its own pace, indifferent to individual grief. There is a phrase that gets used often in discussions about incarcerated individuals: rehabilitation. It is a word that carries genuine hope, the belief that people can change, that circumstances can be addressed, that the person who committed a crime is not necessarily the person who will emerge from prison decades later. It is a belief that a functioning society arguably needs to hold, at least in part, to function at all. The challenge is that it requires assessment. Careful, honest, consistent assessment of who a person actually is, not who they appear to be on paper or in a parole hearing. And the case of James Opleton Bradley raises serious questions about how thoroughly that assessment was conducted. During his years at prison, Bradley wrote, "This fact alone is not unusual. Many incarcerated individuals turn to writing as a way to process time, experience, or thought." What Bradley wrote, however, was notable. He authored 2 short stories. One was titled The Beast Within. The other was called Serial Killer. In both pieces, his characters murdered women in scenes that were sexually charged and detailed. The writing was not abstract or metaphorical. It was specific in its violence and appeared to reflect something more than creative exercise. Whether these writings were meaningfully evaluated by the parole board is a question that has never been fully answered in the public record. What is documented is the outcome. On February 11, 2013, after serving approximately 23 years of a life sentence, James Opleton Bradley was released on parole. He was 50 years old. He was, by all outward appearances, a man ready to reintegrate. Bradley found work through a landscaping company owned by a man named Steve Mott. The job took him to properties around the Wilmington area, including a farm in nearby Pender County, a rural stretch of land that would become significant later. He moved through his new life with the deliberate ordinariness of someone who understood that appearing unremarkable was its own kind of strategy, though whether Bradley was consciously performing normalcy or simply living it is something only he could answer. What investigators would later establish is that within months of his release, Bradley had begun targeting women in the Wilmington area who were vulnerable, women dealing with substance addiction or instability, women who might welcome a steady, seemingly supportive presence. He positioned himself as helpful, dependable, safe. Alicia Tucker was 33 years old. She lived in Leland, just outside Wilmington, and she had come to know Bradley after his release. By the summer of 2013, the two were in a relationship. Her family described her as someone with warmth, a person who, like many people in difficult circumstances, was doing her best to navigate a life that had not been easy. In late August of 2013, Alicia Tucker disappeared. Her mother reported her missing in October, after months of silence. By that point, the trail was already cold. Investigators noted her disappearance, took the report, and the case entered the slow bureaucratic drift that missing persons cases sometimes fall into, particularly when the missing person is an adult with a complicated history. No body, no confirmed crime scene, a gap in the record where a person used to be. Bradley, during this time, continued working, continued living, continued appearing unremarkable. And then, in April of 2014, Shannon Rippey Van Newkirk vanished. Shannon was 53 years old. She worked alongside Bradley at Steve Mott's landscaping company, which meant she was not a stranger to him. She was a colleague, someone he saw regularly, someone he had spoken with, shared work days with, existed alongside in the ordinary way that co-workers do. On April 5, 2014, Shannon was seen entering a bar called Husk in downtown Wilmington. It was a Saturday. She had plans for the following day, her 54th birthday, which her family was preparing to celebrate with brunch. When she did not appear, her mother, Roberta Lewis, contacted police. Shannon Rippey Van Newkirk has never been found. Phone records obtained by investigators showed that Bradley and Shannon had exchanged 17 phone calls between April 1st and April 5th. On April 5th, the calls stopped. Traffic camera footage placed them together. And when investigators approached Bradley, his story began to shift. First he had not seen her, then he had, then they had argued, then she had jumped out of his truck and run off. Each version was slightly different. None of them led to Shannon. The investigation into Shannon Van Newkirk's disappearance moved with growing urgency once detectives pieced together the phone records and camera footage. Bradley's criminal history, the 1988 murder of Ivy Gibson, the life sentence, the parole, was not something investigators could ignore, and they did not try to. He was arrested on April 29, 2014, charged with first-degree murder in Shannon's presumed death. even though her body had not been located. That same day, investigators were searching a piece of farmland in Pender County, the same property in Hampstead where Bradley had worked through his employer. They were looking for Shannon Van Newkirk. They found someone else. Buried approximately 3 feet beneath the surface, wrapped in multiple garbage bags and secured with duct tape, arranged in a fetal position, was the body of a woman. She was not Shannon. She was Alicia Tucker. Alicia had been dead for months. The manner of her death, determined through forensic examination, was blunt force trauma to the head followed by strangulation. DNA evidence recovered from Bradley's vehicle later connected him to her killing with the kind of certainty that does not leave much interpretive room. The farm where she was buried, the same farm where Bradley had worked, the same fields he had walked through with a landscaping crew, had held her body while the world searched for someone else. The discovery changed the shape of the case entirely. What had begun as a single missing persons investigation became something larger and more troubling. Prosecutors now faced 2 victims, 2 separate deaths, and a man who had already killed once before. A man whose writings in prison had described in detail exactly this kind of violence. For Bradley's defense, the cases presented different challenges. Shannon Van Newkirk's body had never been found. Prosecuting a murder without a body is not impossible. It has been done successfully, but it requires building a circumstantial case strong enough that a jury can reach certainty beyond reasonable doubt without physical remains. The phone records, the camera footage, the changing stories, the history, prosecutors believed they had enough. They were right. On June 29, 2017, a jury in New Hanover County convicted James Opleton Bradley of second-degree murder in the death of Shannon Rippey Van Newkirk. He was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years and 5 months, with a maximum of 37 years and 6 months. Before the verdict, prosecutors had made an offer: a life sentence, in exchange for the location of Shannon's body. Bradley refused. Shannon's family left the courtroom without knowing where she was. They still don't. The Tucker case moved separately through the courts. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. The trial was scheduled and rescheduled across multiple years, delayed by the complexity of capital proceedings and the weight of building a case for the state's most serious punishment. Bradley, throughout, maintained his position. He had defense attorneys, he had legal process, and he used both. On March 26, 2019, the jury returned its verdict in the Alicia Tucker case: guilty of first-degree murder. Bradley narrowly escaped a death sentence. He was instead sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would not be walking out of any door again. The farm in Hampstead, the field where Alicia Tucker had been buried, the ground that had kept her hidden for nearly 8 months while her mother wondered and her family waited, was no longer just a piece of rural property. It had become a crime scene. And then, in the way that places eventually must, it became something quieter and harder to name. A location where something irreversible had happened that would now carry that history permanently, even as the grass grew back and the seasons turned. The legal conclusion of a case and the human conclusion are almost never the same thing. Verdicts are rendered. Sentences are handed down. The paperwork is filed, the court dates end, and the machinery of the justice system moves on to the next matter. For the families left behind, none of that movement resolves the questions that settle into the bones. Shannon Rippey Van Newkirk's body has never been recovered. Her family has spent years without the closure that physical remains can offer, incomplete in its own way, but a different kind of incomplete than simply not knowing. Her mother, Roberta Lewis, publicly expressed the anguish of that absence in terms that any person of conscience would find difficult to read without feeling something shift inside them. Shannon would have turned 54 the day after she was last seen alive. That birthday has passed many times now, unmarked by her presence. Alicia Tucker's family has their grief, and they have the knowledge of what happened to her, and they have the name of the man responsible now sitting in Tabor City Correctional Institution without possibility of release. Whether any of that constitutes justice in a meaningful sense is a question each person in that family likely answers differently on different days. The family of Ivy Gibson, the 8-year-old girl whose death in 1988 first brought James Opleton Bradley to the attention of the justice system. carried their loss for decades before the world paid attention again. Ivy would have been in her mid-30s by the time Alicia Tucker was buried in that Pender County field. She had been gone for 25 years by then. Her death had resulted in a sentence, a parole board decision, and a release. And then 2 more deaths. The question that this case leaves most persistently in the air is not a simple one. It is not, was James Bradley a dangerous person? The answer to that question was established in 1988 and reaffirmed in his own prison writings. The more complicated question is, who bears responsibility for what happened after the parole board opened that door in February 2013? Parole systems exist within a framework of legal and philosophical assumptions about human capacity for change. Those assumptions are not inherently wrong, but they must be stress-tested against evidence, not just behavior during incarceration. A man who writes stories about murdering women while serving time for murdering a child is not presenting an ambiguous picture of his inner life. The picture he presented was legible, and the decision to release him was made anyway. Alicia Tucker went missing in August 2013. That is 6 months after Bradley walked out of prison. Shannon Van Newkirk disappeared in April 2014. That is 14 months after his release. These timelines are not incidental. They are the shape of the failure. James Opleton Bradley is currently incarcerated at Tabor City Correctional Institution in North Carolina. He is serving concurrent sentences for the murders of Shannon Rippey Van Newkirk and Alicia Tucker, the first-degree murder conviction carrying with it a life sentence without parole. He will not be released. He is 62 years old. Shannon's whereabouts remain unknown. Her family has continued to press for information. Whether Bradley knows exactly where she is and chooses not to say, or whether the passage of time and the nature of the land have made recovery impossible even in theory, is something that cannot be determined from the outside. What can be determined is that he was given the opportunity to provide that information in exchange for his own life, and he chose silence. That choice says something. Exactly what it says about the internal world of James Opleton Bradley, what drives a person to protect the location of a victim's body even when it costs them nothing and could give a grieving family something irreplaceable, is something that forensic psychologists and criminologists have spent careers trying to understand and have still not resolved into a clean answer. What this case leaves behind, beyond the verdicts and the sentences and the investigative timelines, is a set of questions about systems and accountability and the cost of institutional decisions on individual lives. Ivy Gibson deserved to grow up. Alicia Tucker deserved to be found when she first went missing. Shannon Van Newkirk deserved to celebrate her 54th birthday with her mother. None of them got what they deserved. And somewhere in North Carolina, in a field or a lot or a stretch of ground that has kept its secret through rain and seasons and years of searching, Shannon Rippey Van Newkirk has not yet been brought home. That is where the story ends. Not with resolution, but with a question still open, still breathing, still waiting for an answer that may never come. Her family is still listening for it. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.